Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the first of this real world evidence for decisions public webinar series, supporting HTA payer decision making with a spotlight on national health data initiatives. And today we're looking at Finland and Spain's health data initiatives, and we're getting a reflection from a patient representative about patients' views in terms of access and the importance of real-world evidence in decision-making, particularly for HTA and payer decisions. And we're going to put up now on the next slide a few housekeeping rules. This is a webinar, so we'll have 3 presentations, but then there will be plenty of time for questions in a panel session. So do use the Q&A button to ask your questions, and you can like other people's questions. As you've heard, the meeting is being recorded, so it can be viewed by you or colleagues later. And when you're asking a question, just indicate where you're from so that we know the audience. We do like to be multi-stakeholder. This webinar will go on for an hour and a half, but we do intend to have 30 minutes for questions, so do get involved. And if we go on to the next webinar, I'll just explain that I'm Karen Facey, working for the Secretariat of Real World Evidence for Decisions, but I will be joined later by Dr. Matti Apro, who is the co-moderator for this meeting. And Matti is a leading oncologist involved in many oncology networks internationally, and most recently is the immediate past president of the European Cancer Organization, and he'll be leading the panel discussion later on. But at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Jodekok to give us an introduction to real-world evidence for decision and why this webinar is important. Thank you, Jo.
Thanks a lot, Karen. From my side, also a warm welcome to all the participants. We have noticed that there are around 200 persons which are registered from different backgrounds, but also from different continents, because we can also welcome a lot of Canadian friends who are thinking with us and with the network, the Real World Evidence for Decisions platform, on the use and the importance of data with regard to creating evidence. And I think this webinar is very important and very timely and relevant. But let's say a few words about the Real World for Decisions initiative. You know probably that we are a learning network. We try to exchange information, think together, act together, and discuss together, exchange ideas together in order to get robustness in the real world for decision framework. It's a network which is composed of payers, of HTA people, of regulators, of clinicians, of the pharmaceutical industry, of patients' organizations. And we are applying 2 basic principles, which is cooperation, collaboration, and transparency. And I think it's important to get this. It's not behind the scene, but we are the scene, and we have to think together. What we are doing is to try improve decisions with regard to innovations and highly innovative technologies, even sometimes confronted with a lack of evidence, and we try to fill these gaps on a robust and transparent way. We are built on these principles I've mentioned already, and we are trying by organizing webinars, workshops, and doing advocacy work to bring the context of data on the scene. And this, let's say a few words about the importance of this webinar this afternoon. Alongside the initiatives which are taken by the European Commission, and I come back to that, with regard to health data and the health data space, we can see that a large number of countries are developing or have developed strategies with regard to health data and the use of health data. Those strategies, in our opinion, are a vital element of the digital transformation of our healthcare system. When we look closer to those strategies, we see that they are all underpinned by a number of priorities. And I think a first priority is to unlock the potential for data-driven innovation and improve the access to data, not at least for the patients themselves, but also for research. Secondly, I think these strategies have the objective to make appropriate data sharing and data linking the norm and not the exception in the health system. I think it's an important one because it is a paradigm shift we see in our health systems. And the ultimate goal of that is to deliver the best care as possible and to support clinical research and clinical treatments. And thirdly, it is necessary, of course, to build the right foundations on a technical basis, on a legal basis, on a regulatory basis, and on all these levels that make possible this data use in an appropriate way with respect of the fundamental privacy rules. We know that it's not an easy, but a long and complex task, as we will see in the examples which will be given by the three presenters of the different countries. It's a necessary one, and the COVID crisis has had a large and a huge impact in accelerating this process, but there are still barriers for the development of the process. We cannot ignore that these are challenging endeavor we should take working on, and we are not beginning on a blank page. Meaningful collaboration has already been initiated to promote data and digital capabilities. And it is useful, as I said, to benchmark and to compare these initiatives which are underway and which can be regarded as best or inspiring practices for us all. And this means for patients, authorities, clinicians, carers, analysts, industry, researchers, and innovators. And I'm sure that the three examples we'll present it to you will give food for thought, and I hope also food for action in your country. It's not only relevant, but it's also timely. Today, we have noticed and we have been informed that the European Commission will unveil the regulation with regard to the European health data space, in which, of course, a role of the different member states will be clearly defined. And therefore, I think it's very relevant and also timely to see what's happening in these countries. And tomorrow we will see in the newspaper and other information channels what was presented today by the European Commission. Have a fruitful debate. Let it be an interactive one, and over to Karen.
Thank you very much, Jo. We certainly look forward to being inspired by our three speakers today. And it's my pleasure to welcome Pierre Himo, who's going to give us a spotlight on Finland, looking at the secondary use of health and social care data in Finland. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the invitation to present. I work at the Finnish Medicines Agency, so we have a small HTA team there that assess new hospital medicines. And so my perspective is sort of a data user perspective and HTA perspective. So I promise to reflect how does the Finnish data ecosystem support HTA payer decision making here in Finland. And next slide, please. So I think we have a very holistic approach to secondary use of health and social care data here in Finland. For starters, I chose this slide that describes different real-world evidence applications throughout a pharmaceutical product lifecycle just sort of to make a point that managed entry agreements and managed entry of new medicines is just one use case for real world data. And in Finland, one of our leading secondary use of data principles is that the same data should be entered into our systems once, and then it should serve multiple different use cases. So if I would say that we need to develop the secondary use of data in Finland to better serve the needs of managed entry processes, then I would certainly need to justify why these needs should be prioritized over so many other possible use cases. Next slide, please. So having said that, I wanted to show you how many different stakeholders are actually involved in the managed entry process of new hospital medicines in Finland. So starting from the company's HTA submission to us at Fimea, responsible for writing the HTA report that then informs the national recommendations and leads to national negotiations that are led by Helsinki University Hospital Pharmacy, and so on. So my sort of observation is that having so many different public stakeholders involved in this process is actually a challenge for using real world data to support HTA payer decision making. Nowadays, I think mainly because the roles and responsibilities of these different operators are not completely clear when it comes to using or generating real world evidence, and also because the resources and expertise are scattered in different organizations. So with this slide, my point is that it's not enough to have exceptional data ecosystem. You also need to optimize the processes where the data is used. Next one, please. I think I would argue that we have comprehensive and high quality data resources here in Finland that consist of health and social data and also collections of biological samples. And in this slide, I've grouped the data sources to national registers, biobanks, hospital data lakes, lab data, and quality registers. And in the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about the hospital data lakes. But I think the key challenge with almost all of these data sources are the limitations related to exposure data at indication-specific level and outcome data. And in this slide, I want to share some notes related to hospital data lakes.
I think maybe a slide has been skipped, so perhaps we can go back a slide. Is it the next slide?
Yeah, the next slide, please. This one. That's great, Karen, thanks. So for many research questions, highly specified individual level clinical data is essential. And we've, in our work, observed that, for example, the companies have started to use these hospital data lakes as a source of data to describe, for example, the current standard of care in HTA submissions. So data lakes are storage repositories that hold vast amounts of raw data. And data lakes collect all the data from different operational sources in one centralized repository. And they contain enormous amounts of structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data, such as patient chart, text, lab records, operations data, and healthcare resource use data. And this can then be accessed both by data queries and text mining tools. So this data lakes is something I think that we see a lot used in the Finnish context, but not so much when we look at the international context. Next slide, please. So this is sort of the same process slide that I started with, and I've now added some key data sources that can be utilized to inform different phases of the managed entry process. And I think it's important to say that we need different data sources to inform different types of questions. So there's no one fit for all solution or data source. And I personally think that the importance of hospital data lakes will grow. And one key reason for this is that we need indication-specific sub-ICD-10 level data, and there will probably not be enough resources to set up quality registers for every disease. And we've also seen that some of our university hospitals are integrating disease-specific register solutions to their core electronic health record that enables better standardized data entry to the system. So to our understanding, that data could then be accessed through hospital data lakes. Next one, please. So here's a bit complex slide of Finland's data ecosystem. And you can see that there's two operators here, FinData and FinGenius. So FinData is the data permit authority that grants permit for the secondary use of social and healthcare data and improves data protection for individuals here in Finland. And after granting the permit, FinData also combines and pre-processes data and offers a secure operating environment and tools for analysis. And FinGenius then is a gateway to biobank data. And I think with this picture, it's important to say that things are not done in silos, and the interoperability is really the key. And in the sort of lower part of this picture, you see governmental support. And it's important to say that this ecosystem is being built with strong governmental support, and that the enabling legislation is really important in this setting. And government has also invested in several centers of excellence, such as Cancer Center and Neuro Center, that can both impact the generation of real-world data and use it in research and development and other purposes and use cases. Next one, please. So here's my final slide for today. So for us, the ability to link data from different sources is really essential for generating rich data sets for different purposes. So in Finland, all citizens have a unique personal ID number, and that allows the combination of individual level data from various data sources, and also, which is really important, enables longitudinal data collection. So for example, data collected from hospital data lakes can be enriched by linking data from external sources, sources such as reimbursement register or cause of death register. And as I said, the same data should be used for many different purposes. And in Finland, we're building an ecosystem that should allow safe and effective use of data. And with the needs that relate to managed entry of new pharmaceuticals, we really need to be proactive, and we also have to do some work of our own, so that the processes that we have can make the best use of the data sources in the future. This was the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I think many of us know how great the data sources are in Finland for both health and social care data, but what you've reminded us there is not only that concept of collect data of good quality once and use it many times, but there are many other users. So we in the HTA payer world need to explain what use we want of the data and why that's important, but also that your explanation there of the different operators involved in pricing and reimbursement negotiations and managed entry agreements is something for us, I think, to reflect upon, because I think your situation would be quite similar in other countries. It's not just the HTA body or the social insurer that has a role to play. There are other actors, and we need to align what we want with the health and data space, as it were. And so great work going on there, all underpinned by legislation and government support. So that is a superb national example. And I don't think we've got any questions of clarification. So I think we are going to hold all questions until the panel. So we will come back to you to discuss that further. Thank you so much, Pia, for that great presentation of what's happening in Finland. We're going to move on now on our wee tour of Europe. And we're going to move to Spain to hear about Valtamed, which is the information system to determine therapeutic value in real clinical practice. And we're delighted to welcome Carlos Martin Saborido, who is an advisory member for health and services and pharmacy in the Ministry of Health. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for inviting me to share this time with you. So let's start with the first slide. So Valtamed is an information system, as Karen mentioned, to determine the therapeutic value in real clinical practice. So we try to use all the information coming from real clinical practice, trying to deal with the high health and economic impact of new drugs and new technologies on the national health system. Next slide, please. So I would like just to give you the five ideas or 5 hints about how Valtamed works and how it's doing in the last 2 years, because the Valtamed is in November. We celebrate the 2nd year of working of Valtamed. So let's go ahead with the first of the ideas, the context. So all of you know that we have a complex context, including high uncertainty about all clinical outcomes, so reduced clinical benefit, surrogates, high risk of bias, etc. So in this context, Valtamed started 2 years ago collecting data. So currently we include 20 drugs based in 14 protocols. So each of these protocols, so every drug, is linked to a pharmacoclinical protocol, which is a document designed by consensus. This is one of the key things in Valtamed. This protocol is designed by consensus between experts from all autonomous communities of Spain, professional societies, and also the manufacturer. So all of them need to decide by consensus what information is going to be collected and be part of the Valtamed registry system. You can see this link and you can find all the protocols translated into English and all the reports we are doing. So far, the reports are only in Spanish, but probably in the next month, some of them will be available in English. Next slide, please. So this is a list of all drugs currently in Valtamed. I have added, apart from the name of the drug and the indication, a column saying if there is a protocol or not. And I would like to stress in that point, because some of these drugs has protocol because they are part of an outcome-based management entry agreement, and some of those drugs, for example, all the drugs in the second block on the right for severe atopic dermatitis, they don't have any protocol. The reason is because the first drug we evaluate or we assess for severe atopic dermatitis was dupilumab, and we made a protocol for that. But all the new drugs for severe atopic dermatitis, we are collecting information, we are doing new registries just to have enough information to use them as a comparator if a new drug comes into the market. So not all of them has protocol because of that. Next slide, please. So here you can see, for example, one of the main screenshots coming from the Baltermed tool. This is one of the examples. You have all the information with the clinical follow-ups, all drugs, and all on the right you can see each of the rows of the picture down right is one of the patients, and we collect their information about the hospital and everything. Obviously, we haven't put any personal information on that because as you can imagine, all this information is under a pseudonymization method, and it's impossible to track who is belonging the information. So next slide, please. This is how you can download all the information from Baltermed. So as you can see, we have a patient code on the far left, and then well, the age, some different calculations for the age, some date, sex, and everything. So all the information can be downloaded in this format, this is Excel, for example, for any data analysis we can need. We have deleted the autonomous community and the center, obviously, for you not to be able to track anything. But all the information can be downloaded in this format. Next slide. Okay, so the current use of the real-world evidence collected in Baltermed. All these data are linked to the evaluation of the financial conditions agreed in the administrative resolution. So there is an administrative resolution which establishes the criteria of reimbursement using the real-world evidence collected in Baltermed. That is, this protocol we mentioned before, we developed the protocol, and within the administrative resolution, we put all these variables or all these data we need to collect in order to, well, to pay the drug or make the reimbursement or whichever is inside the administrative resolution. One thing is not always present is a review clause. I mean, sometimes we can put a review clause saying, okay, at 12 months, we are going to review the results, and then we can establish if the paper performance is going on or not. So we currently only have reviewed 2 protocols after 12 months of data, and the payment performance is over now. Okay, so that means that the all the information we have collected during 12 months are the basis of the decision of going ahead with the payment of one drug or not. But we still collect data, so we are not stopping collecting data. Okay, so next slide, please. You can see here one of the administrative resolutions. Sorry, but it's only in Spanish, obviously, because it's a private document, so it's not a public one. And you can see part of the information in one resolution. We have put in black the private data not shared with the public. So next slide, please. So in terms of building the administrative resolution, who lead how is going to be paid the drug or how is going to be the contract, the resolutions are built on a case-by-case basis. So there is not a general rule. So each time a new administrative resolution needs to be written, we need to go ahead with all the stakeholders and work on that. Always there is a minimum set of outcomes to assess the value of the drugs. That means we are going to put a minimum set of outcomes, but because there is a big group of people involved in the protocol, we always collect much more variables that we need to make write the administrative resolution. That is, we take advantage of the collection of data to have more information that probably is going to be needed in the future, not for the paper performance agreement, but probably for any other reason. So in the current real-world evidence-based designs we have a percentage of the manufacturer requested, and then linked to a paper performance for the remaining amount. We have sometimes 100% of paper performance or nothing at the very beginning, and make the pay later on. So we have different systems to use this information. Next slide, please. So here you can see one of the protocols you can see in the web page. Next slide, please. So the last 2 points are related to the successes and the hurdles. So the successes, the first one I would like to stress on the good collection of data per decision or condition. That means that we collect data for one drug, and that allow us to have a comparator with new drugs coming for the same indication. So this allow us to use real world comparators. So another important thing I would like to stress is the protocol is agreed, and we have a follow-up commission at autonomous communities level. That means each of the autonomous communities of Spain meet, they have a kind of internal meetings with the manufacturer to make a follow-up and trying to see if all the data are collected properly, if all patients that have received any new drug is on the list, is on the register, and trying to fix if something is not going well. Another important thing is the availability of epidemiological linking data. That means sometimes when we are working on a budget impact analysis to make a report supporting the payment and reimbursement decision, sometimes we don't have clear data, epidemiological data. And that means that if we collect data for some conditions, in the future, we are going to have data collected by us, so are very important. So Baltomed is a modular information system. That means that we are adding new modules with the new designs. One of the modules we are going to include in shortly is the quality of life module. That allow us to have patient-reported outcomes also linked to all the variables collected by the clinicians. All protocols are translated into English, which is fine. We can share this information, and sometimes even we can discuss internationally if this is the protocol is well done or we need to improve something. And of course, the publication of results, evidence generation. We are now publishing two kinds of reports: descriptive ones, which are shorts, and another ones which include comparison with the clinical trials supporting the drugs. Next slide, please. The hurdles, of course. The first one, I think, the collection difficulties due to clinicians' workload. Sometimes we have double entry. That means that sometimes we ask the clinicians to collect information and put into the system, and they are also collecting this information for another European registry, example. So this is something we are working now, but so far it's a big difficulty. Another thing is trying to balance the ease of use for clinicians. That means that the clinician can put all the information easily in the system, and also easy of data analysis. Sometimes we face problems, for example, trying to make easy for the clinician to collect some information about, for example, safety or adverse events. Trying to facilitate the clinician put this information difficult as later on to make a good data analysis. So this is something we are struggling and we need to improve. Finally, we expect to address in the following evolutionary developments two main things. The first one is the web services to send large amount of data. that allow us not to have everyone writing or putting all the information in the system, but trying to get the information from the clinical records and make a massive sending of information. And also the development of some APIs, application programming interfaces, linked to electronic medical record. That means that the clinician only need to put extra information, but not all the information related to the patient clinical history. Okay, next slide. I think that's it for Valtermed. I'm happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That's a very clear presentation about how that bespoke information system is not just being used for reimbursement renegotiations for outcome-based agreements, but also you're stressing there, you're continuing to collect data to understand utilization and to optimize care in the future. And that's so important, that this isn't just about pricing negotiations, it's about optimizing care for patients. There is a question that has come through of clarification for you, and it's asking, you mentioned that there's a lack of epidemiological data, and is that for all sorts of diseases or some particular categories of diseases?
Yes, and sometimes it's for some extremely rare diseases where there is not enough information in some registries, and if you check the information published, you can find some data from Europe or even from the United States, but sometimes it's difficult to translate that in a Spanish system. So this is the thing. Sometimes if we don't have good information, we can fail in making some payment and reimbursement resolutions the first time. But if we collect good information next time, we are going to trust in our data better. Yeah, not all the indications, but some of them.
Absolutely, and I think in many countries we sometimes struggle to get the good epidemiological information, which is the basis. And just one more question for you before we move on to our next speaker. There's a question here about the paper for performance schemes, whether they are by autonomous community within Spain or whether they're agreed nationally.
No, they are agreed nationally. Yeah, sometimes this is a good question, but yeah, they are agreed nationally, and the autonomous community just can make a special deals in terms of paper volume or something like that. But the main scheme, payment scheme, is decided nationally in a committee where all the autonomous communities are represented.
Brilliant. And I'm just going to throw in one more question that's appeared from asking if the data sets from Valtermed are publicly available.
No, they are not publicly available for two questions. The first one is because the law doesn't allow us to make this public. And the second one is because all these data are under a system that have not all the information needed to track a patient, but too much information, and you can track, for example, all the results by hospital, and this is not fair. I mean, that's why are not publicly available. That's why we are publishing reports of each of the protocols with enough period of time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carlos. You can see that's generated a lot of discussion, and we'll come back to that discussion later on. It's now my pleasure to invite our third presenter, and real world evidence for decisions is multi-stakeholder. So our next speaker is a medic who's speaking on behalf of patients associations, and JeanPierre Thiery is a senior medical advisor for the Umbrella Association of Patient Organizations in France, and he's the member representing patients associations on HAS's Transparency Committee. JeanPierre, we welcome you.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. As you say, just want to add that I have no conflict of interest to disclose. Next slide. So I just want to discuss with you more on rather theoretical ground, and thank you for the very nice presentation and very on two interesting systems in Finland and Spain. My point is based upon my experience as a member of HTA committee assessing drugs. But first, to remind you that the objective of patient involvement is to give a voice to patient and public, and most importantly in this topic, to use the relevant information in the HTA process. So in order to have the proper collect of balanced information, of course, we have to deal with representativity, which is of great interest for the patients association mainly, including vulnerable groups. Transparency and fairness, ethical issues are addressed, and through the management of conflicts and interest. In many countries, maybe in France, it's a very hot topic. We have to increase public confidence and trust in the healthcare system, and most basically in the regulators, and sometimes with the industry and some other stakeholders. Next slide. So to give you the situation today in France, in 2017, we already have patients and users represented in the committee membership of HAS, which is the HTA body of France. But we were lagging behind some country like England, Canada, and Scotland, where we had the comparisons. And in 2022, next slide, as committee membership, we have 3 members out of 22 with 2 votes and 1 suppléant. And we also, we have allowed, the HIS has allowed also the contribution by patients, which is read by the members of the committee membership under a template. We try to formalize the patient experience through indicators. And we also have a board membership now at HIS. I didn't put Germany as I put it in the first slide because I don't have the current situation in Germany. So I don't want to compare with Germany at this point. Next slide. So first of all, to go back to the framework of patient and public involvement in HTA, one of the main goals, and we may discuss that when I mentioned the proper indicators, is to introduce most importantly, the patient-reported outcome measures, the PROMs, which are most likely missing in many clinical research because it's not what the regulator has to have market entries, and sometimes also PREMs, which represent the patient experience. But dealing with HTA PROMs is a major issue, and it's one of the leverage we could have is to have the patient's organization on board, because it speaks to them, in a very pragmatic and important role, and it should play a more important role in clinical care. Next slide. So, next slide, please. So I want to go back to the rationale behind real-world data, real-world evidence, to remind you that we've seen in the past, in the last 20 years, an acceleration of market entries of new drugs, dubbed innovative drugs, first in the FDA in the US, and followed by the EMA. And I will only mention the innovative drugs in the following slides. Next slide. And sorry, I think I should have take off this transition. And as patient organization representative, especially in France, the time to availability is a major issue. I mean, there's a consensus among organizations that we need to have a fast access to efficient and even innovative drugs. And sometimes you see this kind of comparisons. And I want to stress the fact that in this comparison, you see that France is the middle of the pack, which means it has a lower time to availability than Germany, for example, Denmark. But then in France, that's my major point for you today. Since many years, we have an early access program called ATU. So next slide. And one example, for example, if I take a major immunotherapy drug for cancer, in fact, through this early access process in France, the patient could have received the drug since mid-2014. Also, the drug was officially reimbursed, appeared on the list of reimbursed medicine only in 2017. So next slide. So it's very difficult to interpret in the literature the time to availability, because even IQVIA, we made the story for FPIA, recognize that if you introduce early access for France, for example, the mean time is only 224 days. More recently, there is an evolution toward an even earlier entry procedures in France called accès précoce, which is accelerated approval, pre-market accelerated approval, and post-market accelerated approval. It means that since the drug has an EMA approval, should it be conditional, and it's more and more the case, through the process of accelerated approval, the drug could be made available in France, and it could be even before the market approval by EMA. So next slide. So we have in many respects a very fast availability to drugs in France that is not reflected in the most used, most common international comparison data that are totally biased if you don't take this into consideration. My point is that France is exposed to this phenomena of incertitude, the lack of proof of the traditional good level of proof when new drugs are presented to the market. Again, most of the organization I work with are familiar with this, and they're willing to have this, what they see as a process to have a high, fast availability of new drugs. But it causes some issue I want to discuss with the next slide. The problem, I will just focus on cancer drugs because, as you know, a big part of this accelerated process are concerning cancer drugs. And what we've seen through the experience in the last 6 years by being involved in HTA and discussing the HTA process is that we have seen the abandon of the traditional gold standard studies, phase 3, that have been replaced by phase 2, or more recently, even by single arm trials starting with the and it started with the most refractory patients. So that's where in the literature, the real world data, real world evidence comes in. I mean, it's heavily linked for me with the acceleration of the market entry process. And so you have two sides. You have, of course, real world evidence is now needed to evaluate effectiveness of drug. It says post-market, but it's already on the market. And I will add, it should give the opportunity to introduce the good indicators, which is quality of life and PROMs, which are basically lacking from what is requested to have market approval at the moment. And Karen, you've already mentioned it. I mean, we want to do that because it's not only good if a new drug is so-called accessible on the market, it means that it's reimbursed. It's in the list of reimbursement, but you have to deal with real access to the real people. If I take an example of one of the first immunotherapy for metastatic cancer, you can see in the literature that Europe is compared to the US, and the US, it was much earlier, although the price was very high, but only 50% in 2018 of the patient had access to immunotherapy for metastatic melanoma, although 1 year and 2 years later in Europe, 100%, almost 90% of all the patients are eligible to this new regimen. So we don't only have to deal with effectiveness of drug, we should assess the access to drug. We should, through IT, also know better about the patient journey. Most of the drug will have an impact of resources of organization, and also because we need the IT also to measure the evidence practice gap, because the variability is enormous. In fact, if one recent study, for example, you could say that only, even in oncology, maybe only 50% of the procedures are up to date in certain countries. Next slide. Our experience with HTA also is really to stress the fact that, and it is well known by most of the audience, that a randomized controlled trial introduce many bias. Also, it's a very good methodology, but you create ideal conditions. Although if you oppose that to real world evidence, as I said, we can estimate the effectiveness in the general population, which might be less biased that for obvious reasons than in a clinical trial. We have a better understanding of the toxicity. And as I said before also, we should monitor the uptake of treatment in the general population. The issue we're facing is that methodology speaking, it's a really big challenge because the elimination of bias or confounders, if you look at real world evidence, is a real challenge. Next slide. So just to start on the right of this slide, I said, this is the future. We know that, and I understand that real world evidence should remain a priority of public health policy, not only for validation or sometimes invalidation of expedited approval drug, but to ensure better quality and safety of care. But what are the main challenges are the methodology issues of real world evidence against the traditional RCTs. The long life cycle of IT project. Also, we've seen two very good examples of what could be done, sometimes in smaller country or at the regional level. The secondary use of relevant data when available is a real challenge. Interoperability issues will take a long time, in fact. It's easy to say that we have already had the standards, but even within the realm of standards, you might have difference, and it's very demanding. It will need very big investment in big data infrastructure. I might come back later in the discussion. I will stress the fact that we are facing workload issues with the clinical staff and the healthcare professionals, and it will be critical in the post-pandemic era. We could not ask people to fill in forms in larger quantity without a proper organization, compensation when they exist, and we really have to be feet on the ground there and not dreaming without considering the workload issue. Also, fragmentation and waste is a real risk because we can face duplication. Well, there's some resistance in France to move to market entry agreements because we're going to duplicate database. You know, we could increase fragmentation. We won't be able to answer all the issues about how using a comprehensive IT system, not only to assess the new drugs. Independence and transparency. Who should pay for that? Is it a public-private partnership? What is the role of the public? What should be the role of the industry? And also, not last but not least, RGPD, and I will add data trajectory. I mean, you know, there's a discussion about the cloud, sovereign cloud. Should we use a cloud that the data may be accessible from US companies? It's a real hot debate at the moment. And to go back to the HTA, my main topic, it's preposterous to think that we could not go back to the gold standard. And I cite here Pasteur, which is the head of oncology in FDA, and you can read what he said. I mean, the drug makers might be in love with single-arm trials, and there's no reason to do a phase 2 trial of 100 patients other than getting after getting FDA approval. So that's why I wanted to put back in the context what we are dealing with. And next slide, I think it's the last one. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for that very clear explanation with a perspective there from France, which I think is an international perspective and not just about cancer, but relates to many other diseases, particularly rare diseases, and in relation to perhaps to the ATMPs as well. What you identified there was that in many countries, there are some early access programs. I think there are questions about whether data are collected in those programs, but also that there are accelerated regulatory approvals, which mean we have a paucity of traditional clinical trial randomized control evidence, which needs to be augmented with real world data. But I love your kind of addition there that then leaves us with uncertainty about, in a sense, the quality and safety of care for patients, for which we need to collect additional information about access and equity of access across a health system, about the optimal patient journey, and filling that evidence practice gap, understanding that evidence practice gap and improving it is so important. So I think at that stage we can take down our slides, and that has happened magically. Thank you, Secretariat. I don't think there are any individual questions of clarification for Jean-Pierre, so I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator Matty to take on the main part of the discussion with the panelists, and I encourage you all to type your questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you very much, I would like to thank all the three speakers first, because these were very informative talks, very clear. And of course, we do have some questions that have come during the last talk on the Q&A that we might want to take up. And also we had at the beginning a very general question that we decided not to take because we want to keep it for the general discussion time. So if I take here the questions that I have in the Q&A, Christoph van Freshem has asked a very important question addressed to Karen and to everyone, therefore. And the question is, in all of these countries, we have heard about the example of the prescribed medications, but we know that patients use drugs which are not under prescription. And how does this fit in this whole evaluation system? Who would like to take this question?
It's a very good point. At least in France, we know that in certain disease, there is a high level of consumption of non-traditional care. And that includes homeopathy is well known. It has been reimbursed in France, but it's still used. But also you have hypnose, sophrology. And if you're mentioning also nutritional components or whatever, you know, it could be added to the regimen. And the issue is that it's used in parallel for the patients, by the patients. And sometimes the caregiver is not exactly aware that the patient has another track, I would say. So you're just pinpointing a general and important issue there.
Thank you. And actually, reading better the question, the issue is also another issue that we do face, at least in my area in oncology, when we prescribe oral drugs. We know extremely well, we have documented this in the past 10 years quite nicely, unfortunately documented. Patients are prescribed something, actually they never take the medication. And depending on the systems, you can find out that they actually are not taking. And we know that the attrition rate, for example, in breast cancer for hormone modulators is about 20 to 30% in the first 3 years, i.e. 70% of patients will adhere to the treatment proposal and 30% will stop. And many of these will never say this to the clinician. So who would like to discuss this? Because this is a very important point in trying to understand the reality of the data which is being collected.
Well, if I may.
Please go ahead, Pia.
Thank you, Matti. So first of all, with the sort of over-the-counter medicines and medicines that are not prescribed, I think it's quite difficult to find data. Full coverage of data from that perspective. So it's a hard part to sort of tackle. And with the adherence, that's also challenging, but we know that there are methods to use sort of our prescription data and dispensing data sort of to estimate if there are like gaps between the purchases, for example. So you have different methods and wide range of research covering adherence, but to have that actual data if the medicine is taken or not by the user, that's not entered in the system. So you need to estimate that using methods that are fit for purpose in some specific areas and then not so well in others, I think.
That's true. Any other comment to this specific question?
Yeah, well, no, it's a traditional bias of clinical research to have very good adherence during a clinical trial that we will not have in the real world. What we've been looking at the real world is the import of health literacy and patient education. And at least in France, we see, for example, the pharmacy network, I mean, the retail pharmacy, they want to change their business model and increase the service to patient, including patient education. And this is really very good because not only they have the database with everything prescribed, it's called the pharmaceutical record, but it doesn't give any clue about what really the patient is taking. So you're right, the average adherence might be 50% and even lower, even in chronic disease. So by introducing a better relationship with the pharmacist and with the doctors, with the healthcare professionals, we know we can improve the adherence. But as I say very often, before increasing the adherence, we have to increase the pertinence and the accuracy of prescription. That's very important as well. In countries where you have a volume effect due to the general architecture of the system, the reimbursement scheme, in some respect, before looking for the adherence, we have to reduce unnecessary prescription and over-prescription.
Absolutely. Carlos, you want to comment?
Well, I think is everything I wanted to say is said by Pia. I mean, we can follow the invoices, we can follow the prescription, we can track if a patient has taken the drug from the pharmacy, but we cannot track if the patient is taking or not. I mean, which is a difficulty and a problem of adherence.
Absolutely. Just from a general perspective, as a practicing clinician, what would be quite helpful for the clinicians would be a system whereby the pharmacist could be allowed to contact the prescribing doctors to say, your patient that has this prescription has not filled it in for the last 3 months. So then you can kind of have an alert that something is going wrong. But this, unfortunately, at least in Switzerland, does not happen.
Yeah, I think this is something can do with the what JeanPierre has said. I mean, if there is a good alliance between pharmacists, clinical, and patients, probably this type of alerts this type of issues can be solved, or at least can be followed.
Just for discussion. Okay, then at the beginning of this whole discussion, we heard Joe de Kock telling us that today we have the European Commission presenting some thoughts about the European health data space. And Toon Digdef is asking here to all of the 3 speakers, what do you expect is going to happen? What would you like to hear from the European Commission on the European health data space? So let's start with Pia from Finland.
Well, that's a difficult question. What we have now, like we all know that it's today that the sort of the proposal is out, and we've all obviously looked at the draft that was sort of leaked before. So we are combining, so we know that we need to look at this from multiple perspectives and sort of combine expertise. So this is led by our Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, so that they will sort of use the expertise from different organizations to gather our comments from Finland. And I think Fimea, Finnish Medicines Agency, because we are part of the EMA network and the National Competent Authority in the European health data space, we are interested in the Darwin EU system and things that are related to that. That's one of things that we follow closely in the European health data space context. And then I think as a medicines agency, we will look what is written related to e-prescriptions very closely. Thanks.
Yes, and I saw Carlos nodding while you were speaking. So Carlos, you'd like to make a public comment?
Well, I think in Spain the main concern about the European health data space is how to deal the 17 health system we have in Spain, how we are going to deal all this information coming from different sources and make a package and put in contact with the European health space. So I think we have to think about that, and there is a lot of institutions working on this from the different autonomous regions and also from the Ministry of Health. So I think this is our main issue now, is how to put all our data together.
Yeah. And Jean-Pierre, from a patient perspective.
Yeah, well, let's start with the confidentiality and privacy issue. It has always been a concern, and as you know, Fran, through his privacy body, CNIL, was instrumental in addressing the issue at the European level. So it was, I think, important to have the RGPD. And on top of that, now you have an interesting discussion of Europe competition versus the GAFAM. I mean, you have companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon are entering the healthcare business, big time, actually. So I'm not demonizing the private sector saying that. I'm just saying that at the European level, we have discussion about autonomy and a European offer that could be competitive at the international level. And then two, it crisscross the privacy issues as the main leverage for the citizens and for patients. And so if you take countries like, and it goes back to the, as was said before, to the role of the public government, the public service and the regulators in implementing the solutions. And should it be through private-public partnership, including also some American companies? But that's the situation now. I will just add that for me, and I worked on the subject in the past, it's, and I put it somewhere in the slide, it's a long-term issue. I mean, any reasonable project dealing with IT, should it be on a hospital level, a country level, as a 10 to 20-year span. And nobody should forget that. I mean, if you want a full-blown advanced hospital system, it's between 7 and 15 years to complete. If you want that at the regional, national, European level, well, we should start with the 20 years project. I mean, the project you find in big engineering project do like that. If you want to buy an EPR nuclear plant solution, it's a 20-year, 30-year span. If you want to do the Airbus for Europe, should it be in IT, it's a 10, 15 years project. So short-term political agenda has no future.
That's a very clear statement, Jean-Pierre. Karen, you would like to intervene?
Yes, just to say that the chat have put the proposal into the secretary put the proposal into the chat. So I haven't quite read the 122 pages while you've been speaking. But just to share with the wider community that we had a roundtable meeting within Real World Evidence for Decisions last week, where we worked with Science Sarno, the National Institute of Public Health in Belgium, and with the NHS Confederation, who have been looking at the work packages, which is evaluating policy options to overcome the barriers to secondary use of data. And there are about 11 barriers that were identified, but we particularly looked at issues around anonymization, pseudo-anonymization, and around kind of data management and curation issues. And I think for me, the kind of take home from that multi-stakeholder discussion was that we need to be careful about over legislation, as I would call it, of too many aspects, because we need to think about all member states within the EU and ensuring that we're not being too strict on some, because many member states, particularly in Central Europe, for example, have very different capabilities and capacities than perhaps the bigger member states or the Scandinavian member states that have a long history of good tradition of health data. So we need to align and to learn from one another, maybe to have rule books, etc., and to share what we can to ensure that good data governance, but make sure, as the Good Finish principle says, that we are collecting good quality data, that we understand how it will be used, and then make sure we have appropriate governance in place to achieve that. So I shall read the 122 pages tonight after the webinar with a glass of wine probably, but I think it will be a good topic for a future webinar.
I believe it's the important topic for a future webinar, because we have to look at this document and see what is positive there, which is certainly a lot, and also what we feel could be done in a better way, as you already commented. It's usually like that with all kinds of documents. But all of this brings me to a general question that has already been mentioned, is the use of the data, how the data is being collected. And we have this famous GDPR on the top of our heads. Every country, every region in every country has a different opinion on what is allowed, what is not allowed, how to do, how not to do. So maybe a couple of examples from our speakers on what is going on in their countries. How is GDPR interpreted? And I add one question here, which reminds me of many, many years ago in Switzerland, when suddenly the Swiss citizens discovered that in the central government in Bern, and Switzerland is very much divided into cantons that are very proud of their independence towards Bern. Bern is Brussels, Brussels, Bern, same feeling, and that data were being collected there that no one was aware of, except of course the office that was collecting the data. So my question is GDPR 1, and then the other question is, in your countries, how do you ensure that the citizen who owns the data, because it is his, her data that is being used, can have access to this data? So let's start with Carlos.
Thank you, Mati. Well, I think this is one thing we have solved here in Spain in terms of getting data to collect in Baltermed. So all the data that the patient gives to the clinician are collected in the electronic health record. And our legislation say that if patient is giving information and this information is in the electronic health record, this information can be used anonymized for research or investigation purposes. So we don't have to ask for a new consenting form or other type of form to manage this information. And in terms of the data you mentioned, here is quite different, because it's not the same relation between users and data in all the regions, but most of the regions, they have like a citizen file. The citizen can access with some certificate and see in this file or lab test or reports from emergency visits or whichever.
Thank you. And how is it in Finland, Pia?
Well, as I said, we have this national data permit authority called FinData. So one of FinData's most important objectives actually is to improve data protections for the individuals and data security also. And we have in Finland the Act on the secondary use of health and social data, and that has been drawn up based on the EU's GDPR regulation. And in that process, the Constitutional Law Committee and the Social and Health Committee have sort of ensured that the Act does not contravene with the GDPR. That's sort of the system that it was implemented here.
So Jean-Pierre, from the perspective of the representative of the patients, what you just heard, is that enough? Would you like to hear more?
Yeah, first of all, the public and patient involvement in France started 20 years ago with the law called Démocratie Sanitaire. So, and one of the first achievement was to ensure that patients have access to their medical record. Of course, a copy of their medical record. And now in France, what characterized the approach is, first, we have a project of patient control healthcare health records called My Health Space, where the patient has access and control on the content, some of the content of medical record. He could also feed the information in his space. And we have another project called the Health Data Hub, which is also state-run, based on the information already collected by the insurance. The CNAM in France, which is a very large database with all the French, but it's medico-economics, and then it should be enriched by clinical data. So there's this very general strategy to have the state owning or regulating the data. And part of it, of course, will be the compliance with RGPD, where you have the privacy body of France, CNIL, looking at the situation. This is the general scope. There's another challenge that I didn't mention is the hackers. Is a big concern now in France and in many countries, and the risk is that if we don't not sufficiently alerted about the risk of hacking, is that it could decrease the population confidence, and so on the short term also what is discussed is to increase the safety of healthcare information systems.
Absolutely so, and not only the safety, not allowing it for non-authorized access, but we also have to realize that in some situations the data is not kept in a way that is 100% safe. And I've heard from some centers that where they had data from a few years ago, which was encoded in a way, and they had no access to the data because they couldn't uncode it again. It's unbelievable that this has happened. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot there, and we have to be very, very careful. If there are no further comments about this GDPR question, and thank you very much for the examples, and certain that this is also a topic that we should face one day in a general discussion. I think Jean-Pierre, you were one that clearly voiced the concern of many clinicians, and that we are asked to fill in all kinds of documents, and every year there is a new set of documents that you are being asked to fill in, but at the same time you're not given more time, you're not given more support to do that, and then you are starting to be in trouble because you would like to do it but you cannot do it. So how do you see, how can we help the people that should enter these data into these databases for them to be really useful and representative? What could be done from your perspective? Then I'll ask also the other speakers to discuss this point.
Well, that's the explicit critique I mentioned regarding the strategy to implement real-world data, is that in fact there is a risk that we will have silos or layers, and with some level of duplication. For example, by therapeutic class, if we do one database per product in a real-world assessment, then we're going to multiply the database, and we might be limited in the exploitation of available data. So. But the real issue is to go back to the users, and there we have several problems. One of them being that on the course of informatization, let's say if I start with an hospital, at some point you have a decrease in productivity, and we know that, and it will take maybe 7 to 10 years to have a return on investment. 7 years is a short return on investment if you go in a full-blown hospital information system to the level where you almost have no paper, which is theoretical, but you know what I mean. So if we look at real-world data, real-world, we might be on the same track. We might face a decrease in productivity in a way, and then we have to cope with that. And with time, we have to change the tools. Secondary use of data, of course, is the solution. It has been already very well addressed. But to go there, you first have to have the proper tools for healthcare, for the healthcare production. And we don't have them yet. And it's an issue. So you still have to progress by ameliorating the tools for the clinical practice, and then put the data for real-world data as really secondary. And I'm not sure in the process of accelerating market entry, we might reverse the priority, and start to increase the available data outside of the hospital, the healthcare setting, making the investment outside of the healthcare system. And that might be an issue and a real problem.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Carlos would like to make a comment about that.
Yeah, well, I agree with Jean-Pierre. I think we need to invest in hospitals and how to collect the data in hospitals instead of trying to make big developments outside the system. And but it's true. We are. I mentioned in the presentation that sometimes we are overloading the clinicians, and they have no time to fill all the forms. So that's why one of the evolutionary developments we are planning is trying to use new applications to extract the majority of the information needed from the electronic health records, and trying to keep just a few things for clinicians to report.
Pia, any comment from your side?
Well, just that I think the benefits of entering good quality data should be seen in the primary purposes, what the data is sort of entered for. So in the patient care with individual patients, and that, from my perspective, that's a good motivation sort of to get good quality data for secondary purposes also. But the sort of first thing is always to look at the primary purposes where the data is entered for.
That's a very, very, very interesting answer. And this allows me to ask you one question that comes from our audience. We have in the Q&A here from Brad Jordan a question. Are researchers required to submit requests to FinData for secondary use of electronic health records, or can researchers partner directly with medical sites provided appropriate consent is in place?
So the researchers should apply a data permit from FinData when multiple data from multiple controllers are combined. So if data from only one controller is needed, then the researcher can sort of apply for a permit from that data controller, unless the data controller has sort of agreed with FinData that FinData will cover their services also.
Okay, so there is in the chat an interesting comment about the fact that access to medical data is regulated, and this comment addresses the fact that a personality, this is in the UK, his family records, which were accessed by a junior doctor, had nothing to do with the care of this person. And this junior doctor, even though he didn't disclose anything, was then charged about the fact that he had accessed these data. I do understand this point, and then there's a further comment here from Richard Simpson. But on the other hand, I think we said earlier that we have to be very careful about not putting too many blocks and hindrances about the access to data, or then we can, unless one day the reality is that patients really go around with a little card which contains all their own data and then can give it to the person that needs to access those data. But until then, you have to access the data and you have to have it open. And I'm speaking especially about emergency rooms. And that's one of the problems that in the very distinguished country, which is not part of the European Union, but is supposedly very well organized, in which I live, which is Switzerland. If you go to the emergency room in the neighboring state, before you can get access to the data from the original state in which canton, the little entity in the little Switzerland, it can take hours because of the way everything is coded and uncoded and decoded. And what are your comments about that? Because the data access is of primary importance, and it relates to the fact that how data is coded, because you want to then access it, but you have to be able to access the way it is coded, and it is coded in different ways in different countries, in different regions, different centers. So I see Carlos nodding about this, so please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I understand perfectly, because we here in Spain we have 70 regions, and it's supposed to have a national health system, but each region has a different card with different code system. So if you go to another region, the clinician can access only to a very few data from you. So in terms of emergency visit, where probably you are not able to transmit all the information to the doctor, is an issue. Yeah.
Pia, what is the reality in Finland, which is, of course, my parents' country, and I know that the Finnish health system is pretty good. Always, everything can be better, but it's a pretty good system. So how does it happen in Finland?
Well, I must say I work as a pharmacoeconomist at the Finnish Medicines Agency, so I don't dare to comment, because I think I don't have detailed enough knowledge about this.
You might have heard about something. Okay, fine. Perspective of the patient community, JeanPierre.
Yeah, well, historically, the main objective of the patient control electronic health record in France, called Mon Espace Santé, is primarily at the origin to address the needs of access during emergency. And also after that, we said, okay, it could be a tool for better coordination of care. You know, for example, discharge letter should be part of this patient control electronic health record. And to achieve that, the strategy chosen by France is to have one platform. Of course, that will aggregate the data progressively from the different hospitals and care providers. And in a large country like France, you know, the heterogeneity, as in many other countries, is very important. So what the ministry has done in the recent years is to have leverage and funding the interoperability progress at the GP or the hospital level, not only for their own sake, but also to feed in the PCEHR, Mon Espace Santé, which has been launched only 2-3 months ago. So to answer your question about emergency, that's one of the rationale between the PCEHR in France, the patient control electronic health record, knowing that the patient could also add something to his record. And in some countries might have a copy on his smartphone, for example.
Thank you very much, JeanPierre. I do see that we are getting to the end of the time allotted for us, and there have been further comments in the chat that we will not be able to address, one of them being a very important one about the informed consent forms that are given to patients that are so variable, study per study, center per center, with IRBs having all kinds of different ideas about this, but this will have to be taken in another session about these kinds of questions. So we're getting to the end of a very, very informative session, I believe. You have all contributed. The questions have been remarkable. They have allowed our speakers to go in further depth about what is the question that we are facing, which, to simplify in very simple terms to me, is that there are lots of efforts, and they all tend to go in the sense of better data usage, respecting the patient's privacy, and unfortunately, the diversity of all the systems makes it relatively complex, but we can learn from each other. And this was the whole purpose, was to hear from examples that can give ideas to others. And we will continue in RWE4Decisions webinar series to discuss about these various perspectives in various areas of common interest. So you have here the last slide. It tells you that you will have a recording and a report of this webinar available on the website. Don't hesitate to get back to our secretariat. They'll be considering every question that you send them and asking the appropriate person to reply. And please do join us for the next webinar, which is going to be in September 2022. We'll keep you aware of that. Please come to the website of time to time to have further information. And the symposium is going to be, we hope, an in-person symposium on November 24th in Brussels. So Karen, the last word is yours.
I would just like to say thank you to Matti, to all the speakers and to all the presenters for a great discussion today. And we look forward to seeing you at some time in the future. And let's all go now and read what the Commissioner have got to say about the European Health Data Space. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.